1903 Studio Portrait Unearthed, and historians gasp when they enhanced the inscription on the book. The air in the Boston Historical Society's basement was thick with dust and the smell of old paper, a scent that Sarah Mitchell had come to associate with forgotten stories waiting to be uncovered. She had been working as an archivist for 3 years, cataloging donations that arrived in irregular waves from estate sales, attic cleanouts, and the descendants of long-dead Bostonians who no longer knew what to do with their ancestors' belongings. But nothing in those 3 years prepared her for what she would find on that cold January morning in 2024. She was methodically working through a recent estate donation, carefully documenting each item in the database, when her gloved hands pulled out a cardboard box labeled simply Family Photos 1900s in faded marker. The box had been sitting in a storage unit for decades, according to the donation paperwork, forgotten until the death of its owner triggered a cleanup. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that crumbled slightly at her touch, was a formal studio portrait in remarkable condition. The photograph showed a well-dressed family frozen in time. A stern-looking man in his 40s with a thick mustache and dark suit, his wife seated beside him in a high-collared dress with intricate lace detailing, and 4 children arranged around them in descending height order. Their faces were serious, almost solemn, as was customary for photographs of that era when long exposure times made smiling impractical. Sarah carefully placed the portrait under her desk lamp and examined it closely. The studio backdrop was typical of the period. Elaborately painted drapery and classical columns suggesting wealth and respectability. The family's clothing was expensive but not extravagant, indicating middle-class prosperity rather than genuine wealth. But something caught her eye that made her lean in closer. In the background, barely visible on an ornate mahogany table positioned behind and to the left of the family, sat an open book. She reached for her magnifying glass and leaned in closer, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. The book's pages were just clear enough to suggest there might be writing or illustrations on them, but the resolution of the original photograph, limited by the technology of 1903, made it impossible to read anything specific. Still, after years of looking at thousands of historical photographs, she had developed an instinct for when something was unusual, when an element didn't quite fit the standard compositions of the era. Sarah flipped the photograph over carefully. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written in elegant cursive, "The Family, Murphy Studio, Boston, March 1903. Nothing else. No names, no occasion, no hint of who these people were or why this particular moment had been deemed worthy of preservation and expense. Sarah photographed the portrait with her high-resolution camera and uploaded it to her computer, watching as the image appeared on her screen in crisp digital detail. She zoomed in on the background table, examining the book more carefully. It was definitely open, displaying 2 pages, and there appeared to be markings on the visible pages, possibly text, possibly illustrations. But even with digital enhancement, the details remained frustratingly unclear. The photograph's age and the limitations of early 20th century photographic technology created a barrier that her standard equipment couldn't penetrate. She saved the file and made a note to bring it to her supervisor's attention. Something about this photograph felt significant, though she couldn't yet articulate why. Perhaps it was the father's expression, which seemed particularly intense, almost challenging. Perhaps it was the way the mother's eyes seemed to hold a secret, a burden visible even across more than a century. Or perhaps it was simply that book, positioned so deliberately in the frame, that felt intentional somehow. Dr. James Harrison stood behind Sarah's desk 3 days later, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied her computer screen. As the senior curator of the Historical Society, he had seen countless old photographs cross his desk, but he had learned to trust Sarah's instincts. She had a gift for spotting the unusual, the significant, the stories that deserved deeper investigation. "You think there's something worth pursuing here?" he asked, adjusting his glasses and squinting at the magnified section showing the book. "I do," Sarah replied, pointing at the screen with her pen. "Look at the positioning. Everything in studio photographs from this period was carefully arranged. Photographers charged by the plate, and families paid significant money for these portraits. Every element was deliberately chosen and placed. Why include an open book in the background unless it meant something specific?" James nodded slowly, considering her argument. "Fair point. These weren't casual snapshots. Every object in frame was intentional. What do you propose?" "I want to send it to the digital forensics lab at the university. They have new imaging software that can extract details from historical photographs that weren't visible even a few years ago. Technology that can work around age degradation, enhance contrast, and pull out information that the original photographers never imagined anyone would be able to see. If there's anything written or illustrated in that book, they might be able to make it legible." James studied the photograph for another moment, then nodded. "Do it. Let me know what they find." 2 weeks passed before Sarah received an email from Dr. Chen at the university's imaging laboratory. The subject line read simply, "You need to see this." Attached were 3 enhanced images, each showing a different section of the book's pages, now rendered in startling, almost shocking clarity. Sarah opened the first attachment with trembling fingers, her coffee growing cold on her desk as she stared at the screen. The left page of the book showed a geometric symbol she recognized immediately, one that made her breath catch in her throat. A compass overlaying a square, positioned at precise angles, the unmistakable emblem of Freemasonry. But it wasn't just a simple drawing copied from a textbook or reference guide. Surrounding the central symbol were intricate diagrams, lines connecting various points in complex geometric patterns, annotations in careful handwriting, and what appeared to be degrees or measurements marked at specific intervals. The second image showed the right page, covered in dense handwritten text arranged in neat columns. Even with the significant enhancement, some words remained unclear, blurred by age and the original photograph's limitations, but several phrases were perfectly legible and deeply revealing. Third-degree ceremony, Master Mason, obligation of silence, and, most striking of all, a list of names with dates beside them, formatted like a registry or membership roll. The third image provided a wider view, showing both pages together along with a portion of the book's leather cover, where gold-embossed letters spelled out partial words that Dr. Chen's software had reconstructed as ancient and accepted Scottish rite. Sarah picked up her phone with hands that were actually shaking now and called James. "You need to come down here right now," she said, her voice barely steady. "I know what we're looking at, and if I'm right, this family was hiding something that could have destroyed them completely." Within an hour, James was back in her office, and they were both staring at the enhanced images in stunned silence. Sarah had pulled up several reference books on Freemasonry and laid them open on her desk, comparing the symbols in the photograph to illustrations in the texts. "My God," James whispered, running his hand through his graying hair. "That's not just any Masonic book. That's a ritual manual, a working book that would have contained the actual ceremonies and secrets of the lodge. These weren't sold publicly. They were handmade or specially printed for high-ranking members only. And it's in a Catholic family's portrait," Sarah added quietly. In 1903 Boston, that combination would have been absolutely explosive. James looked at her sharply. "How do you know they were Catholic?" Sarah pulled up another document on her computer. "I've been researching. The Murphy studio was located in the North End, which was predominantly Italian and Irish immigrant territory. The family's clothing and the modest studio suggest they weren't Protestant elite. And look at the children. Those are Catholic school uniforms, I'm almost certain." They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications of what they had discovered. Sarah spent the next 2 days barely leaving her desk except to use the restroom and grab increasingly cold coffee from the break room. She needed to understand exactly what they had discovered and why it mattered so profoundly. The more she read about Freemasonry in early 20th century Boston, the more the weight of the photograph settled on her shoulders, and the more the mystery deepened. In 1903, Boston was a deeply Catholic city, its population swelled by massive waves of Irish and Italian immigration that had transformed the city's character over the previous 50 years. These immigrants brought their Catholic faith with them as a cornerstone of identity, community, and survival in a new world that was often hostile to their presence. The Catholic Church had formally condemned Freemasonry multiple times throughout the 19th century, declaring it fundamentally incompatible with Catholic faith and teaching. Pope Leo III had issued a particularly strong papal encyclical in 1884, specifically denouncing Masonic organizations as enemies of Christian civilization, calling them dangerous secret societies that promoted religious indifferentism and moral relativism. For a Catholic family in Boston to be involved with Freemasonry wasn't just socially awkward or theologically questionable, it was spiritual treason of the highest order. Discovered members faced immediate excommunication, which in those tightly knit immigrant communities meant complete social death. Catholic-owned businesses would be boycotted into bankruptcy, children would be ostracized and bullied at parish schools, and families could be driven from their neighborhoods entirely by the combined pressure of clerical condemnation and community shunning. Yet, paradoxically, Freemasonry was simultaneously flourishing among Boston's Protestant establishment. The lawyers, judges, businessmen, politicians, and civic leaders who controlled the city's economic and political machinery. The Masonic lodges offered powerful networking opportunities, pathways to social advancement, and a sense of brotherhood and mutual obligation that transcended normal business relationships. For an ambitious man, especially an immigrant, trying desperately to climb the social ladder in a society structured to keep him at the bottom, Masonic membership could open doors that would otherwise remain firmly and permanently closed. Sarah found census records from 1900 and 1910, searching systematically for families who might match the photograph's composition. She was looking for a family with the right number of children, the right age distribution, living in Boston's North End during that crucial period. The search was tedious and often frustrating, involving cross-referencing multiple databases and dealing with handwriting that was sometimes nearly illegible, even in scanned form. Finally, after hours of searching, she found a promising lead that made her pulse quicken. The 1900 census listed a family at an address on Hanover Street in the North End. Father aged 39, mother aged 35, 4 children ranging from 4 to 14 years old. The father's occupation was listed simply as merchant. Sarah cross-referenced the Hanover Street address with church records at the Boston Archdiocese, which had digitized many of their historical parish registries in recent years. Her hands were actually shaking as she opened the digitized records for St. Leonard's Church, one of the primary Italian parishes in the North End. There it was, exactly as she had hoped and feared. The family had been registered members, with baptismal records for all 4 children, marriage records for the parents, and regular notations of Easter duty compliance indicating they were practicing Catholics in good standing. The father's name was Thomas Murphy, an Irish name in a predominantly Italian parish, suggesting he was part of the earlier wave of Irish immigration that had preceded the Italian influx. The mother was Mary, maiden name unrecorded in these particular documents. The children were Michael, Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth, their ages matching the apparent ages in the photograph. Sarah found more records in the city directory for 1903, published just months after the photograph would have been taken. Thomas Murphy, merchant, maintained a dry goods store at the same Hanover Street address where the family lived. These combined business residential properties were common among immigrant merchants who couldn't afford separate commercial and domestic spaces. Business records from the Massachusetts Secretary of State's office revealed more. Thomas had incorporated his business in 1895, listing himself as sole proprietor. Property records showed he had purchased the building outright in 1898, a remarkable achievement for an Irish Catholic immigrant in an era when property ownership was often difficult for immigrants to secure due to both economic barriers and occasional outright discrimination. But the most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Sarah found Thomas Murphy's name in the membership records of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, housed in the archives of the Massachusetts Grand Lodge. He had been initiated into Freemasonry in 1887, just 9 years after arriving in America. By 1901, he had risen to the 32nd degree, and in 1902, just 1 year before the photograph, he had been elevated to the 33rd degree, the highest honor in Scottish Rite Freemasonry. The 33rd degree was not simply advanced membership. It was reserved for Masons who had demonstrated exceptional dedication, service, and leadership within the organization. Thomas Murphy's lodge brothers, listed in the same records, included judges, bank presidents, city councilmen, and prominent Protestant businessmen, exactly the kind of powerful connections that could transform an Irish immigrant's struggling dry goods store into a prosperous family business. Thomas Murphy had achieved what many ambitious immigrants attempted, but very few accomplished. He had penetrated the Protestant establishment by joining their secret brotherhood. The connections he made through the lodge had clearly given him access to credit, business opportunities, legal protection, and social networks that would have been utterly impossible for an Irish Catholic through normal channels. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the photograph on her screen with new understanding. Thomas Murphy's expression no longer seemed simply stern. It now appeared defiant, almost challenging anyone who might judge him for his choices. Mary's tense posture and tightly clasped hands took on new meaning as well. She must have known. She must have lived every day with the knowledge that her husband was committing what the church considered a mortal sin, that their family's prosperity was built on a foundation of spiritual treachery. The cost of Thomas's success must have been enormous. If his Catholic neighbors on Hanover Street discovered his Masonic membership, they would have destroyed him economically and socially. If the parish priest found out, excommunication was absolutely certain, and the shame would have extended to his entire family. His children would have been pariahs, unmarriageable within the Catholic community. Yet if he abandoned the Masons, he would lose the business connections that allowed him to compete with established Protestant merchants, and his family would likely sink back into poverty. He was trapped, Sarah realized, walking a razor's edge between two incompatible worlds every single day of his adult life. She found more records documenting the Murphy family's trajectory. The eldest son, Michael, had attended Boston Latin School starting in 1904, highly unusual for an Irish Catholic boy. and almost certainly made possible through Masonic connections, as admission to the prestigious public school was theoretically merit-based, but practically controlled by Protestant administrators. The daughters had attended private academies rather than parish schools, another marker of the family's rising status, and another decision that must have raised eyebrows in their Catholic neighborhood. Then Sarah found something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. In the parish death records for St. Leonard's Church, carefully preserved and eventually digitized, she found Thomas Murphy's name. He had died in January 1911 at age 50, and his funeral mass had been held at the church with full Catholic rites. Father Giuseppe Morelli had presided, and Thomas had been buried in the Catholic section of Holy Cross Cemetery. Somehow, incredibly, his secret had remained hidden until his death. Or had it? Sarah wondered if Father Morelli had known, or suspected, and had chosen mercy over rigid enforcement of church law. It was possible, even likely. Priests dealt with human weakness and impossible situations every day. Perhaps the priest had understood that Thomas Murphy, for all his theological transgressions, had been a good father, a faithful husband, and a man who attended Mass every Sunday and never missed his Easter duty. The photograph took on even deeper meaning now. It was taken in March 1903, when Thomas was at the height of his success, and his secret was still secure. Within 8 years, he would be dead. Sarah's next breakthrough came from an unexpected source that historians often overlook: the personal correspondence sections of old newspaper archives. While searching through digitized editions of Boston's Catholic newspapers from the 1910s, she found a small obituary notice for Mary Murphy, who had died in April 1928 at age 63. The obituary, published in the Pilot, Boston's Catholic newspaper, mentioned that she was survived by her 4 children, all married and successful, and had been a devoted member of St. Leonard's Parish for 47 years. But attached to the digital newspaper file, part of a supplementary archive of materials donated by the Archdiocese, was a handwritten letter that had been preserved among parish records. It was addressed to Father Giuseppe Morelli, the pastor of St. Leonard's Church, and it was dated February 1911, just 1 month after Thomas's death. The letter was from Mary Murphy herself. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the faded but still legible handwriting, now carefully scanned and preserved digitally. "Dear Father Morelli, I come to you with a heavy heart and a confession that has burdened my soul for more than 20 years. My husband Thomas, God rest his soul, was a good man who provided well for our family and never missed Mass, even when he was ill. But he carried a secret that I discovered only 6 months after we were married, and I have kept it with him all these years, never speaking of it to another living soul until this moment. Thomas was a member of the Freemasons. I found his materials hidden in a locked trunk in our bedroom, and when I confronted him, weeping and terrified for his soul, he broke down completely and confessed everything to me." The letter continued, and Sarah read with growing emotion. "He told me he had joined the Masons 5 years before meeting me when he was young and desperate to build a life in America. He saw no other path to success for an Irish immigrant in this Protestant city. The men who controlled the markets, the credit, the suppliers, they were all Masons, and they helped only their own. He said he had tried for 3 years to succeed through honest work alone, and he nearly starved. The Masons offered him a brotherhood, connections, opportunities. He took the oath before he understood what it would cost his soul." Mary's anguish was palpable even across more than a century. "He begged me not to betray him, Father, and I saw such anguish in his eyes that my heart broke. He promised he would attend only the necessary meetings to maintain his business connections, that he would never forsake his Catholic faith in his heart, and that our children would be raised in the church without any knowledge of his involvement." The letter continued, revealing even more about the family's painful secret. "I have kept this promise for 23 years, Father. Our children know nothing. They believe their father was simply a successful merchant, blessed by God's providence. But now that Thomas is gone, I must know, is his soul condemned to hell for eternity? Can I pray for him? Should I tell our children the truth about the source of their education, their opportunities, their comfortable lives? The weight of this knowledge has been crushing me, and I no longer know what is right." Sarah could find no record of Father Morelli's response in the archives, but the fact that Thomas had received a Catholic funeral with full rites suggested the priest had been merciful, perhaps reasoning that Thomas's regular Mass attendance and provision for his family's faith outweighed his Masonic involvement, or perhaps understanding that immigrants faced impossible choices in their struggle for survival. But had the children really remained ignorant? Sarah decided to trace the Murphy children through subsequent records to find out. Michael Murphy, the eldest, had indeed graduated from Boston Latin School in 1908 and then attended Boston College, graduating in 1912. He had become a lawyer, passed the Massachusetts bar, and established a practice that served primarily Irish and Italian immigrant clients. He had married in 1915, had 3 children, and died in 1957 at age 68. His obituary described him as a pillar of the Catholic community and noted his longtime membership in the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal organization that was explicitly created as an alternative to Freemasonry. The 3 daughters had all married well. Catherine married a banker in 1914, Margaret married a physician in 1917, and Elizabeth married a businessman in 1920. The family had clearly maintained and even elevated their social position after Thomas's death, suggesting that Mary had successfully managed the business or sold it advantageously. Then Sarah found something that changed everything she thought she understood about the story. In a collection of personal papers donated to the Historical Society in the 1980s by Michael Murphy's grandson, she discovered a journal that had belonged to Michael Murphy Jr., Thomas's grandson. The entry was dated September 1935, and it began, "Today I found something in my father's papers that has shaken me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about our family history." The entry explained that Michael Jr. had been going through his father's legal files after the elder Michael's death, organizing documents for probate and distribution. Among the papers was a sealed envelope with instructions written on the outside, "Not to be opened until after my death, for my children only." Inside was a letter from Michael Murphy Sr., written in 1934, 1 year before his death. Michael Jr.? His journal entry contained extensive quotes from his father's letter, and Sarah read them with fascination. "My dear children, by the time you read this, I will be gone, and it will be safe to tell you something I have carried alone since I was 17 years old. Your grandfather Thomas, whom you never knew but whose name you bear, was not simply the successful merchant we always portrayed him as. The truth is more complicated and more painful." The letter went on to explain that Michael Sr. had discovered his father's Masonic materials in 1911, shortly after Thomas's death. As the eldest son, he had been going through his father's private study to handle estate matters when he found a locked box hidden behind books on a shelf. Inside were Masonic regalia, ritual books, membership certificates, and correspondence with other lodge members. "I was devastated," Michael Sr. had written. "I was 21 years old, educated by Jesuits at Boston College, devout in my faith, and I had just discovered that my father, the man I had admired and tried to emulate, had been involved in an organization that the Church explicitly condemns as incompatible with Catholic faith. I felt betrayed, confused, and angry." But the letter revealed something else that Michael had found, a personal diary that Thomas had kept, hidden within the Masonic materials, explaining his choices and his spiritual struggles. "My father wrote in his diary about the impossible position he found himself in as a young immigrant. He wrote about watching other Irish Catholics remain trapped in poverty, unable to get fair prices from suppliers, unable to secure credit from banks, unable to rent decent commercial space, all because the Protestant establishment controlled everything and helped only their own. He wrote about his decision to join the Masons, knowing it was wrong in the eyes of the Church but seeing no other path to provide for a future family." Michael Sr. His letter continued with something that brought tears to Sarah's eyes as she read, "But here is what affected me most deeply in my father's diary. He wrote that he attended Mass every single Sunday and prayed for forgiveness for his divided loyalty. He wrote that he raised us in the faith because he genuinely believed in it, despite his own spiritual compromise. He wrote that he hoped someday God would judge him not by his Masonic membership, but by how he treated his family, his employees, and the poor immigrants who came to his store. He wrote that he was a man caught between 2 worlds that refused to coexist, and he had done the best he could with an impossible situation." Michael Sr. had concluded his letter to his children with a reflection that revealed how deeply he had wrestled with this knowledge. "I chose never to speak of this publicly, to protect our family's reputation in the Catholic community, and to honor your grandmother Mary's memory." Sarah sat back from her computer screen, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. The photograph wasn't just a family portrait, it was deliberate evidence, carefully constructed and preserved. Thomas Murphy had commissioned that portrait in 1903, at the height of his success and his secret, and he had made sure the Masonic book was visible in the background. But why? She thought about the enhanced images, about Thomas's intense expression, about the book positioned so precisely on that background table. She thought about the initials TM that Dr. Chen's software had detected embossed on the book's cover, barely visible, but definitely there. Everything about the photograph suggested intention, planning, a message left for the future. 3 months after her initial discovery, Sarah organized an exhibition at the Boston Historical Society titled Hidden Lives, Faith, Survival, and Secret Societies in Immigrant Boston. The centerpiece was the 1903 Murphy family photograph, displayed alongside the enhanced images that revealed the Masonic book. Copies of Mary's letter to Father Morelli, excerpts from Michael Sr., his letter to his children, and historical context explaining the conflicts between Catholicism and Freemasonry in early 20th century America. On the opening night, the gallery was crowded with historians, journalists, and curious members of the public. Sarah had given a brief talk explaining the discovery and its significance, describing Thomas Murphy's impossible situation and the generations of family members who had carried the burden of his secret. As the crowd dispersed to examine the exhibits more closely, Sarah noticed an elderly man standing before the photograph for an unusually long time. He was perhaps in his 70s, well-dressed, with silver hair and an expression of deep emotion on his face. As she watched, she saw tears begin to stream down his cheeks. She approached him gently, moved by his obvious emotional reaction. "Can I help you?" she asked quietly. The man turned to her, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "I'm Daniel Murphy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thomas Murphy was my great-great-grandfather. I never knew any of this, not any of it, until I read about your exhibition in yesterday's Globe." Sarah felt her own eyes filling with tears. She had hoped that some descendant of the family might see the exhibition, but she hadn't expected this moment, hadn't prepared for the emotional weight of connecting Thomas's legacy directly to a living person who carried his blood and his name. She spent the next hour with Daniel, showing him everything she had discovered, sharing copies of the documents, explaining the historical context. He listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking questions, processing the revelation that his ancestor had lived such a complicated, painful, and ultimately courageous life. "I was raised Catholic," Daniel finally said, his voice steadier now. "I still am. I attend Mass every Sunday, just like Thomas did. But I also know what it was like for Irish immigrants back then.